In the year 2000, American historian Kenneth Pomerantz published a book called The Great Divergence: China, Europe, and the Making of the Modern World Economy. In the book, Pomerantz argued that the term Great Divergence described the socio-economic conditions which allowed European countries to advance ahead of others in the 19th century, thanks in large part to Europe's industrial revolutions, which then spread around the world. With Europe, and particularly Western European countries, extending their influence so broadly, it was inevitable that other states would clash with this new system. This lesson looks at how three states, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Japanese Empire, responded to this challenge. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Ottoman Empire was more than a match for any European state. Under Suleiman the Magnificent in the early and mid 1500s, the Ottoman Empire had expanded into Europe and had nearly taken down the Holy Roman Empire. Their army, led by the incredibly well-trained and loyal Janissary Corps, had defeated the Safavid Empire in the east and put a stop to Russian expansion in the north. Suleiman's successors, however, weren't as successful. For instance, in 1571, the Ottoman navy was defeated at the Battle of Lepanto in the Mediterranean. A European coalition, led by Spain, wanted to put an end to Ottoman control of the Mediterranean and to Ottoman piracy. They succeeded in destroying the Ottoman navy. While the Ottomans were able to rebuild their ships, they could not so easily replace the experienced sailors and soldiers who'd been killed in that battle. In addition, the Ottomans began to lose some of their eastern provinces to the Safavids. Moreover, the timing of this defeat coincided with Spain's expanding silver trade and the effect of that trade on prices. Nonetheless, the Ottoman Empire was vast. Just like Europe, they also traded with the East. In fact, the city of Cairo became a trade hub, as it was well positioned to receive goods not just from the rest of Africa, but also from the Red Sea trade, which connected to the Indian Ocean basin. Population rose, reaching as much as 30 million by 1600. However, despite its wealth, the Ottoman government struggled to administer to the people effectively. The Janissaries, who served both as soldiers and as government officials, had become a majority within the government, and they had been able to force concessions. Where once they'd had to remain celibate and devoted only to the Sultan, by 1566 they'd won the right to marry. Sometime around 1600, they began to allow the sons of Janissaries into training, essentially turning that corps into a hereditary organization. In 1683, the Ottomans again besieged the city of Vienna. This siege kicked off the Great Turkish War, which ended with the Treaty of Karlowitz, and the Ottoman Empire's admission of defeat, and the end of its expansionism in Europe. Well, this defeat capped a century of turmoil within the Ottoman army. For example, in 1622, after a defeat in war, the Sultan had blamed the loss on the Janissaries because of their indiscipline. In retaliation, the Janissaries had assassinated him. So this defeat was a long time coming. Well, as it turned out, over that time, the Ottoman sultans had also been losing political influence through the institution of the kafes, or cage system. In the early 17th century, rather than experience a civil war after the death of the sultan, the 13-year-old heir was deposed, and his uncle, the previous sultan's brother, became sultan instead. A year later, the new sultan was himself deposed and became the first inmate of the kafes, which was essentially a form of house arrest. For the remainder of the Ottoman Empire, until the early 20th century, sultans would place their rivals for the throne in the kafes instead of killing them in civil war. This process gave the Janissaries even more influence in the Ottoman government. In 1687, a similar situation arose. The sultan's heir was too young to rule, so the previous sultan's brother was made sultan instead. This established the rule of elderness, which now became the official method of succession in the Ottoman Empire. Upon a sultan's death, his brothers would succeed him in birth order, and only when all the men of the previous sultan's generation had died, did the throne then pass to the next generation. The political instability of the Ottoman state likely prevented their adoption of European technologies, technologies which would ultimately begin the Industrial Revolution during the late Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. While a printing press with movable Arabic type was developed by Ottoman historian Ibrahim Bouteflika, it was shut down in the 1740s, allegedly from pressure from Ottoman scribes who were losing their jobs. A decade earlier, Bouteflika had given a warning. In a 1731 book, he'd analyzed recent Ottoman setbacks, writing, "Why do the Christian nations, which were so weak in the past compared with Ottoman nations, begin to dominate so many lands in modern times and even defeat the once victorious Ottoman armies?" He concluded, "It is because they have laws and rules invented by reason." Of course, another factor in slow industrialization was that the Ottoman Empire had long been an agrarian empire. Its subjects overwhelmingly practiced subsistence agriculture. In cities, however, organizations had emerged which began to coordinate standards for the production of goods. These artisan guilds, called esnaf, served a similar function to those guilds in European cities. Unlike European guilds, however, women artisans were a part of the Ottoman guild system. It was women, for example, who worked in the empire's silk industry, and some women also participated in jewelry production. Now, given the Ottoman Empire's positioning at terminus points of the Silk Road, these guilds had enormous influence over economic policies within the Ottoman Empire. This may be one of the reasons why the Ottomans were slow to industrialize. Another reason was probably just a lack of the natural resources needed for full-scale industrialization. As the image on the left indicates, Britain had all of these resources, especially coal, iron ore, and access to water, in abundance. The Ottoman Empire, not so much. It could produce important raw resources such as wheat and cotton, but without the other resources needed to build and maintain factories, industrialization was difficult. The early 19th century, when many European countries were industrializing, brought more turmoil to the Ottoman Empire. Serbia revolted and won autonomy, and then Greece won independence. In 1839, reformers within the Ottoman government began a process of reform called Tanzimat. The goal of Tanzimat was to preserve and strengthen the Ottoman Empire. The Janissary Corps was disbanded, and a new European-style army took its place. Following European Enlightenment ideals, they wrote a constitution which replaced religious law with secular laws. Tanzimat also brought industrialization to the Ottoman Empire, with the guilds intended to be replaced by factories. The image at bottom left celebrates the arrival of Tanzimat. The reformers have unchained the Ottoman Empire from its past. Then, in the middle of the 19th century, the Crimean War broke out. This was essentially a fight between European powers who were trying to extend their own influence over the Ottoman Empire and its territories. Britain and France allied with the Ottomans against the Russian Empire. And while the Allies were victorious, the financial burden was immense. To make matters worse, the Ottoman Empire faced a refugee crisis. The war took place in the Black Sea and particularly on the Crimean Peninsula. When the war broke out, about 200,000 Crimean Tatars, descendants of the Mongols of the Golden Horde, Muslims, flooded south to the Ottoman Empire and, after the war ended, stayed there. During the war, the Ottomans had seen firsthand the new military weaponry developed thanks to the Industrial Revolution. Steamships had brought soldiers from Western Europe. They fought using breech-loading Enfield rifles. They were accompanied by photographers documenting the war, and journalists cabled back their articles to Europe using the newly invented telegraph. While Tanzimat was a good reform, the Ottomans were already so far behind. The Ottoman government struggled to find the money for investment in industrialization. they depended on investment from European countries, primarily Britain and Germany, to bring factories and railroads to their empire. Then, somewhat abruptly, the attempt at reform stopped. In 1876, a new sultan came to power. While he promised to abide by the Tanzimat-inspired Constitution of 1876, in reality he was opposed to many of the reforms of the era. In 1878, this sultan, Abdul Hamid II, returned to absolutist monarchy. The Ottoman Empire would continue to struggle with industrialization well into the 20th century. Like the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire had long been an agrarian economy. Westernization pushed by czars such as Peter the Great and Catherine the Great had its limits. As these enlightened despots sought to both institute some measure of Enlightenment reform but maintain their power, they ended up blocking new ideas, and this included new technologies introduced in the West. At the beginning of the 19th century, Russia had been a major player in the Napoleonic Wars, which engulfed Europe between 1800 and 1815, and had thus been one of the negotiators at the Congress of Vienna, during which those countries allied against Napoleon, Russia, Britain, Austria, and Prussia, negotiated with France to determine new political borders in Europe in the aftermath of the end of Napoleon's French Empire. At that time, Russia was focused on consolidating its territorial expansion in Eastern Europe and not so much on industrialization. Unlike most other countries in Europe, which had adopted liberal reforms such as the development of parliaments or constitutions during the Enlightenment, Russia had not done so. For the entirety of the 19th century, Russia's czars would be absolutist monarchs who weren't limited by a parliament or any sort of political party. Russia's social and economic system was heavily skewed in favor of the nobility. Well, this was because back in 1649, Russia had adopted a code which legally bound Russian citizens and their descendants to their social classes. Most Russians were serfs. Of those serfs, most were agricultural workers, but some were domestic servants or artisans or even soldiers. And then the middle of the 19th century would come, and just as the experience of the Crimean War had illustrated the Ottoman Empire's backwardness in industrial matters, it did the same for Russia. During that war, it became clear that Russia's few factories, mostly located in the western part of their empire, were insufficient for producing the weapons, munitions, and machinery needed to fight a war. Their railway system was a joke. They weren't even able to use it to get soldiers to the fields of battle or to move supplies to those soldiers stationed in the Crimean. It was clear that Russia was not prepared to compete economically with European countries who'd been industrializing for 50 years or more at that point. It was obviously time to truly begin the Industrial Revolution in Russia. In the middle of the Crimean War, a new Tsar, Alexander II, came to power. Influenced by Russia's defeat in that war and by pressure from reformers within the Russian government, Alexander instituted a series of reforms in the 1860s and 1870s. As a result, this era is called the Age of Great Reforms. Over the course of those decades, Alexander reorganized the judicial and military systems. He set up systems of local government. He invested in industrialization. But the most significant of these reforms was the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. The hope was that these now freed serfs would be able to purchase land and farm it, or that those who preferred to live in cities would move to those urban areas that needed laborers for new factories. As it turned out, though, freed serfs were too poor to purchase land, so most went instead to the cities, where they found work in factories and thus contributed to Russia's industrialization at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. This industrialization in Russia is known as the Great Spurt. In the 1880s, Alexander's son, also named Alexander, would limit the social and political reforms but continue with Russia's industrialization. In particular, he came to depend on a man named Sergei Witte, who was in charge of Russia's railway system. It was Witte who planned and began building Russia's Trans-Siberian Railroad in the 1890s. He also encouraged foreign investment in Russia as a way to raise enough capital, enough money, to industrialize quickly. By 1900, about half of Russia's heavy industries were foreign-owned, mostly by French investors. But Russia had become the world's fourth largest producer of steel and the second largest source of petroleum. So foreign investment had worked. But there were problems, especially in the cities. The class-based tensions that the rest of Europe had experienced in the 1820s through the 1840s, due to how industrialization shifted social classes, now began to affect the Russian Empire. Demonstrations were common, and Russian workers, mostly former serfs whose families had endured centuries of oppression, were attracted to the ideologies of socialism and communism. One particular demonstration on the 22nd of January 1905 was so brutal it was nicknamed Bloody Sunday. So Russia had come late to the game of industrialization, and it was still very much playing catch-up in the early 20th century. Russia's road to industrialization stands in stark contrast to that of Japan. In the early 1600s, the Tokugawa shoguns of Japan had chosen sakoku, a foreign policy of seclusion. Nearly all foreigners were barred from Japan. While Japan would remain in contact with its close geographical neighbors for trade, Europeans, and specifically the Dutch, were restricted to one island. Sakoku allowed for Japan's unique culture to flourish during this Edo culture period. The shoguns used Edo, present-day Tokyo, as their capital. There, they sponsored artists in all genres. Haiku was developed during this time. Kabuki, a traditional theatrical style with live actors, and bunraku, theatrical performances using puppets, were very popular forms of entertainment. Color wood block printing allowed even people of modest means to decorate their homes with color images. Despite its isolation, Japanese universities offered classes in rangaku, the study of Europe and its sciences, or, quote, Dutch learning. There were multiple attempts in the 17th and 18th centuries to force Japan to open up to the world, but these failed, a testament to the strength of the Tokugawa shoguns. However, by the early 1800s, the Tokugawa state had started to weaken. Multiple European countries, especially France and Russia, tried repeatedly to trade with Japan, but they were turned back. However, in 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry and his fleet of what the Japanese called black ships arrived in Japan. Perry showcased American weaponry, actively threatening the Japanese, demanding that Japan open its ports to U.S. ships for refueling and for trade. Perry's demand sparked a crisis in the shogunate. Some advisors advocated capitulation to Perry and pointed to the recent British defeat of China in the Opium Wars. Others, from more provincial areas, argued that the United States was not a formidable power like Great Britain, so a refusal should have few consequences. Well, Perry's fleet returned in 1854, and representatives of the shogun indicated their willingness to sign the Treaty of Kanagawa. This treaty established diplomatic relations between the United States and Japan. By the end of the year, the British would also sign a treaty with Japan. The decision to open Japan up to foreigners sparked greater turmoil in Tokugawa Japan. While the shogun had been quick to try and learn about industrialization from his new trading allies, in 1860, for instance, Japan had sent its first embassy to the United States. There were still those traditionalists in Japan who disagreed with ending seclusion. There were also those in Japan who hoped to finally restore the emperor's political authority. In 1868, the Boshin War broke out. This was a civil war between the Tokugawa shogunate and those in favor of restoring the emperor to power. In the end, those in favor of imperial power won, and a new government under the young Emperor Mutsuhito was founded. His Meiji dynasty would restore imperial power. Japan's age of shoguns was over. In this image at the top left, you can see how Mutsuhito used both traditional Japanese ideals and also modern European ones to showcase his power over the people. The return of imperial control and the accompanying industrialization of Japan is known as the Meiji Restoration. Emperor Mutsuhito focused on transforming Japan so that it could compete with the Western industrial and imperial powers. Mutsuhito harnessed the traditional mysticism and divinity of the Japanese emperors, Japanese nationalism, and the Japanese people's anxiety over the foreign threat, and these were all combined to create decades of focused effort on the transformation of Japan from a decentralized traditional military government, which the shogunate was, to a centralized civil and industrializing state. The ultra-nationalist ideology of the Meiji Restoration coexisted with intense interest in European practices of government, education, industry, dress, and even popular culture. Japan would send people to the Western countries to learn more about those governments, their educational system, their industries. Once those advisors returned, they would take what they learned and apply it to Japan. For instance, note how, in the image at the bottom right, Japanese ladies and gentlemen are dressed in Western fashion. Emperor Mutsuhito abolished feudalism, and with it the system that had maintained the military power of the shogunate. Suddenly, millions of Japanese people were free to move to cities and find jobs in the new factories. Samurai transitioned from military officials to bureaucratic ones. The emperor often sent former samurai to check on factory output. The government invested in telegraph and railway lines, in munitions factories, and in 53 different consumer industries. In the 1880s, the government then sold these industries to private investors, and these entrepreneurs and industrialists went on to found major corporations, some of which are still in existence today. In the image here, you can see the celebration of Japan's modernization. There are steamships and railways. This is a bustling port. Japan has come a long way. The Meiji government also invested in education, establishing a national education system in the early 1870s with the goal of educating the entire populace. The national curriculum focused on mathematics, reading, and science, and also moral education, to ensure a populace that was respectful of the power and authority of the emperor and that recognized its duty to the state. The government also revised its political and legal systems. The emperor retained enormous power. It was he who gave the Japanese people a constitution which outlined their rights. This constitution could only be changed by the emperor or his highest-ranking ministers. A parliament was organized, but only the wealthiest Japanese men were eligible to vote. A legal and criminal system which borrowed ideas from France and Germany was instituted. In many ways, Japan began to look more and more Western. And, like the great Western powers of the late 19th century, Japan too began establishing an empire. And so, the theory of the Great Divergence seems to hold particularly true for the Ottoman Empire, if less so for the Russian and Japanese empires. In fact, Japan might just be the exception which proves the rule. By the early 20th century, Japan had so fully embraced industrialization and imperialism that they soundly defeated the Russian Empire in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. Indeed, in the early 20th century, it seems that the entire world was carved up by just a few huge empires. One can't help but wonder how this imperial system affected the politics of the early 20th century.